We'll give everybody another minute or two to kind of trickle in before we get started, okay?
Sounds good.
I think we got one last one in. But I think maybe let's go ahead and get started. And if we have some others, they can kind of catch up. So I don't think, does this board have a chair, or do we, sorry, this is only my second round on this one.
This is Michelle. I normally am the chair of planning and zoning,
Okay,
but staff is the chair of this committee.
all right.
Because it's made up of both planning and zoning and some other people from the general public. So Brian, you need to just take it away.
That's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure.
No problem.
Welcome to the June 21st UDC steering committee meeting. We've got a very exciting topic today. Kind of our consultants, Chris Brewster's here to go through essentially starting to lay out the framework. So if you think about, to me, it's kind of like the table of contents of what our code is going to look like. So without further ado, I'll let Chris kind of dig into the meat of this one.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, and it is a little bit of a dry meeting tonight, so I apologize for that, but it is, for us at least, a very important step, at least at the staff and technical committee level, because what we're really doing is trying to put together how the code will work. We want it to really become a good decision-making tool, something that's a little bit more user-friendly for the people that encounter the code. So sometimes spending a lot of time on the table of contents and organizational structure may seem a little bit overkill, but we do view it as one of the most important steps in the project. So I'm going to share my screen and run through a little bit of a presentation that'll give you guys essentially really a sneak peek into the nuts and bolts of what we're working on. And I'm going to tie it back to the topics we've discussed as you as a committee, and then through our public engagement as well. So you can begin to see how some of that discussion is at least influence even our framework of the code of how we're putting things together. So let me go to full screen mode here so you can see it. Okay. So essentially, this is our overall scope and schedule. And as you can see, we're kind of right here where framework is, which is why tonight's topic is framework. But this is the schedule we've been working on basically since we set up that engagement strategy. And this step is really launching us into doing initial drafts of the code over the summer months. We've already started some of those initial drafts of some of the more routine sections and things like that, but we'll start getting into hanging meat on this framework from all of the discussions we've had with you all and through the public engagement over the rest of the summer months. Just as a quick reminder, these aren't all the topics you all have discussed, and they certainly aren't all the topics we'll be working on in the code, but these were the main focus points going way back to your code assessment in 2020 before we were even involved. We did a little bit of reorganizing of some of these concepts. So I won't go through all of the points, but this presentation will be available after the meeting as well. But you can see all of the themes that we have talked about and have engaged with the public, and how we, more importantly, how we want to approach them from a regulatory standpoint. What we're really doing is kind of bridging from plans and policies into the types of things we're going to regulate. So we won't be regulating everything that we've talked about. We won't be regulating everything in your plans, but we want to be making sure the regulations are emphasizing the most important aspects of all of these topics, not becoming barriers to things that we might not regulate, but we want to allow, permit, and enable. And lastly, making it a good decision-making tool so all of those things can be contributing to meeting the community's goals. Another quick reminder on this one, the last one, housing attainability. That's the part that's being sort of tagged on through a separate scope that goes well beyond regulations and into policies and programs and things like that. But we do want to make sure that the development code is at least improving or conceptually improving the idea that we'll have more affordable and attainable housing as a result of some of these efforts. We always are cautious that we don't often regulate those things into existence, but again, it's one of those things we don't want the code to be a barrier, and we want to be monitoring and assessing how adding new housing options for all of the other reasons that your planning policies want you to add housing options, what will that do to the idea of affordability and attainability simply by having more options in your community? So with that, this is the beginning of the framework. So the left is the existing code, which if you didn't know, it's in Title 16 of the citywide, the municipal code. Inglewood Development Code. These are the main chapters and headings, and it's pretty typical code, nothing super unusual. We're used to seeing codes organized like this, and it's actually, you'll see as we go through the new framework's not that much different. It's fairly well organized, but I'm just going to walk you through first at a high level where we see things landing under the new code. So the first group of things are things that we're going to reorganize and improve. So we might not be making big substantive changes to these sections, but we might be improving how they're either presented and read, and making it a more user-friendly code. Maybe converting things from less words to more tables. The procedures is a good example of that. And we may be fixing things that, staff has been having problems with, the nuts and bolts and technical aspects of the code. But essentially, these are the things that are going to carry over one for one into the new code for the most part. But not that we're not going to change anything, but there's just nothing that's really large and substantive going on within those. So the organization framework is pretty much the same for these. They may just find themselves in a different place in the code because we want to put more emphasis on a certain subject, or more continuity in the way topics are presented and organized in the big picture scheme of the code. So things like the floodplain regulations and telecommunications will kind of put later in the chapters because they're more standalone topics, not encountered that frequently, and they sort of interrupt the flow of looking at a development project, which might track you through these other chapters here in a more coherent and chronological way of looking at what types of things you need to know about the regulations and when, depending on where you're at in a project. The next set of topics are things that we think we're gonna incorporate and consolidate. So we might be either putting them in a different organization structure, or compressing them into fewer standards because there might be standards in two different places. An easy one for that are the nonconformities, enforcement, and penalties. Those are more nuts and bolts type things of how the code works. So we're going to try to put them up into a subsection of the general provisions rather than have them be a standalone chapter and command a whole topic on their own. We think that will work pretty well. Essentially what we're doing is, the longer those subsections become, then that tells us, well, maybe they need to be broken off into a chapter. So we're keeping the the flow of the code together. I guess one of the things I should have said from the start, each of these chapters under the framework, we already have a large set of sections, subsections, and then subsections. And it's again that idea of trying to keep the topics really well organized, trying to not say things twice when we don't need to, and keep the code fairly concise. So that's an example of that. If we get into that and find out that these sections are really long and lengthy and they start to interrupt the flow of that chapter, then we might break them back out into their own. But at least for now, we think they're going to end up in one. The other thing that we're attempting to do is taking the chapter of the zoning districts and the use regulations and merging that into one chapter that talks about zoning districts and uses. And our reasoning for that is, we do think these following chapters on the physical development form and design are going to really be emphasized heavily. And so the idea of treating this chapter as the kind of the puzzle pieces, where are our districts placed and located, what uses can I do in that district and where, and just kind of ended it there. But combining them into one district made sense from our viewpoint. The next set of things are things that we want to refine or expand upon. So currently, you'll notice currently there isn't a chapter that corresponds with 6, 5, and 6. So we're actually taking some of the more physical development oriented and design oriented things out of these two standards and making them each a standalone chapter for a residential and non-residential development. So basically that will tell you just about everything you need to know from a big picture standpoint of the types of buildings, types of lots, physical form and design, depending on whether you're doing residential or non-residential. And just a reminder, the non-residential will include some components of residential because you have mixed use districts and mixed use buildings, but we will organize those under chapter 6 for the things that are non-neighborhood oriented, essentially. And then the last part of the framework is the things we want to separate out into their own topic because we want to focus on them. I guess I shouldn't say we want to focus on them. Essentially, like for example, signs. It's not something we typically like to focus on. It's a necessary evil in development codes. They're kind of tricky parts of the regulations, and no one gets super excited about sign standards. But we do think it's an example of one of those things. It's a long section in the development standards. It kind of interrupts the flow. So breaking them out into their standalone topics is important. These other ones, access and parking and landscape design, are good examples of us wanting to break it out so that we can emphasize some of the key things we've talked about. And I'll go into that in a moment too, or I'll give you a little bit more flavor of how those 5 main topics are influencing these sections as well. And then historic preservation as well. It's currently found in a couple of different sections of the code. It's not organized under its own topic. So we know it's been a topic that's discussed in the community. We know we aren't going to get all the way to the final solution of how you want to address historic preservation, but it's something we often see as a standalone chapter, and we thought it's probably appropriate for this code as well, to let you build on it through the future. So the next set of slides, I did want to go through each of the topics. Give the bullet points underneath are things that we think are going to be the recommended improvements to the current standards. And then you can start to see on the right-hand side of the screen under the framework, bulleting out some of the subsections that will relate to these bullet points on the left. So although we're putting streets and street design in as a major part of Chapter 3, community design and subdivision standards, that's where they are now, and that's where we think they should be, as that key component of public space, essentially. So they're not things that are regulating private property, but they're regulating how property would be divided. For a community like you, it's not super important because you're not doing a lot of large scale subdivisions or platting of new property. You're basically platted and built out in a block structure, but emphasizing those key things that stretch across multiple developments and the design aspects of those are important. So we want to integrate all of these concepts and the bullet points into that street design section. That's also telling us that when we get to residential design, and when we talked about streetscapes being one, yes.
Chris, I'm sorry. I see that Christine Brinker has her hand up.
Oh, okay, great. Go ahead.
Why don't you finish this slide, Chris, and then I'll ask my question.
Okay. I was just going to quickly, the other thing I was going to mention about the other sections that impact that, that's where we start to begin relating the standards to street design. So for example, residential frontages was talked about as a key component of neighborhood character. Even though it's a private development, we might start keying those frontage designs to different street type situations in the community. So a residential frontage on a major street might be slightly different than a residential frontage on a more minor or neighborhood oriented street. So there's corresponding things that will be impacted. Similarly, in the landscape design, landscape requirements for a development site will be laid out into different components of the site, one of which might be the streetscape landscape, which in some cases should and could contribute to your landscape requirements, so that it's really tying those sites together. So that's it. Go ahead, Christine, with your question.
Thanks. It looks really good so far. I wondered if walkability could be renamed to walkability and bikeability, just to make sure we don't lose that. I know that that's not a title in the code itself, but maybe for presentations for the public or city council.
Sure. Yes, that's a good reminder. And we have that ingrained in how we think about streets, but I understand your point to emphasize it because not everyone listening to us may. So we'll make that change in this presentation as well before we resend it to you all. So that's a good point. Thank you. Any other questions on the streets aspect? Okay, the next one is walkability and parking, and actually one of that does remind me that the title seems a little clunky and strange now, especially after that comment. But one of the reasons we have it labeled that way, if you recall, back when we took the code assessment and verified what the topics were, that code assessment had walkability as a key topic. It had parking as a key topic as well. And what we did was we said, well, there's a walkability component to streets. So let's marry part of that conversation to streets and street design. There's also a walkability component to how you think of sites integrating with site development, integrating with your street systems, and how they're becoming accessible and how they're integrating with the different transportation options you have. So we tied a lot of the parking themes about maybe reducing parking or doing things that help us bring down the parking requirements had to do with getting towards walkability in the end run. That idea of smaller compact sites closer together will make communities more walkable. We can't do that if we have huge, large parking fields for every building. So that's just kind of an aside as to how those topics evolve, but and why we have walkability paired with parking in contrast to that previous slide as well. So as we break parking out into its own chapter, you can see where I'm highlighting subsections 4, 5, and 6. So there's a couple other sections in front of this that is talking about site access and parking and coordinating with those streetscapes and streets. But the key things that we want to accomplish are these points here, and they'll mainly be done with how we deal with required parking, the quantity we're requiring, and the direction we're heading is to be more flexible with ways to reduce it, not considering a maximum, but a soft maximum. In other words, whenever you're having too much parking, we want you to do one of two things, or maybe both: mitigate that or prove that you really need that much parking. But that idea of too much can be as big a problem as too little. But then also the idea of not a strong theme that we heard both in the public comment and comments from you all. Make sure those strategies are context-based. So in our transit served areas, we want to be more aggressive. In our areas that don't have access to transit and aren't as multimodal in terms of walkability and bikeability, maybe those credits and requirements aren't being used as heavily, and we expect that, and we'll be prepared for that. And then I think that the comment that came is, don't push us into things we aren't ready for. One of the conversations was, there's a lot of cities that are deregulating parking altogether. They're just saying it's a market decision, don't require any, and let things shake out where they want to. Probably not ready for that step at this point in Inglewood, but maybe it exists for you at some point in the future. So again, that idea of pushing further, but not farther than you are ready to at this point. And then I think we also heard that there's still a large public concern for parking problems that come with more density or more compact walkable development. That's great, as long as you're not impacting our street parking in our neighborhoods to a degree that is not acceptable. And there's ways to manage that, and the city has programs that are already starting to do that. But that's just an example of, we know there's differing opinions on how big a parking problem is. But one thing we heard loud and clear was all these new ideas for development are great, as long as the parking issue is solved. What it means to solve that might be a different question, and it might be a different question depending on what part of the community you're in. Another correlating part of that is the landscape standards. We'll have a large coordinating component with parking design. I'll mention it actually on the next slide, but there's some sustainability aspects that are big on the parking issue as well. Before I move on to that next one, are there any questions on parking? Okay. Next topic is sustainability. And I think your plans and policies that we looked at have approached sustainability in the way we have presented in the bullet points. And we certainly think that's a good way to approach it. It's a broad overarching topic, touches on many different things. It's sort of a amorphous term. It doesn't have any clear defined meaning other than we want to be doing the best we can with the smallest impact on our limited resources in a lot of different ways. And so in our view, you're doing that throughout the code in a number of things that aren't strictly labeled sustainability. So walkable patterns and more multimodal streets, transit, bike, having transportation options is one of the most sustainable things you can do. And your plans and code are going to be pushing on that as far as we can in a lot of aspects. So there's large scale sustainability that's integrated into all of these different sections of the code. When we get to the block scale, that next scale down, neighborhoods and a little finer grained things that we don't want to be treating simply on a site by site basis. Parking, it could be one of them, although we put it down at the site level scale because that's usually where we catch it. But problems that are better solved by more properties contributing rather than less, and we can have a bigger sustainable impact. So mainly stormwater and how we treat landscape design. And then lastly, at the site scale, making sure the parking landscape standards, making sure anything we're doing isn't hampering people's efforts at renewable energy. We've talked a lot about solar access. We've talked a lot about, how do we deal with landscape standards competing against possibly renewable energy standards. So we're going to want to have flexibility in that regard on all of our standards, but there are some things that we're going to be paying closer attention to and trying to emphasize at the site scale. Some of those may end up getting into either intent statements or design objectives. So there may not be a specific standard telling you you need to do X, but it may have things that tell us that, hey, when you run into a situation where you're dealing with a sensitive north boundary, and we've heard a lot of that in terms of shading and the winter shade and summer sun aspects that are prevalent for your area, we're going to want to make sure those things are elevated to where you can give exceptions. So one of the things the code is building for is we want to have a little bit more flexibility. We want to be doing things a little bit more based on context. And so having those decision-making triggers in there. So a lot of the sustainability things will be more of design objectives or criteria that could then set you up for getting an easier path to doing something that's maybe not clearly regulated in the code, or maybe something that's an alternative to what the standards would have otherwise required. So we expect to possibly run into that issue as we start drafting. And then the last aspect that we've talked about is there's a number of things our code won't do that'll be coordinating with other efforts of the city for sustainability. So there's a lot of policies towards recycling and energy use and things like that. And then obviously monitoring the building code updates. We had the building official present to us. So from our standpoint, we want to make sure that we're not doing anything that's going to contrast with where the building code updates are going, trying to get up to that 2021 code eventually, if not in the near term.
Hey, Chris, we have a question from Brenda, it looks like.
Sure.
Hi, so yes, I'm wondering, you've probably gotten my email and maybe heard from City Council about solar access municipal code. Is that where this is going to fit in the site scale?
Yes, that will be where it will be addressed. That's one of those things where it's difficult to regulate on a site-by-site basis because there are some potentially competing, or at least maybe mutually supportive, maybe competing interests, and it's difficult to tell on a site-by-site of what you do. One of the things we know we don't want to do, or we wouldn't advise, is saying that solar access landscape design, for example, because there's plenty of evidence that a well shaded site can have a far better impact than one with no shade at all but grabbing solar energy. So we wouldn't want to do that and say one's right or wrong in every case. However, we do know solar access is an issue, and the more and more people invest in solar, the more we want to respect that investment and make sure we're not doing things that unnecessarily compromise that, or even doing things that outright undermine that. So, but that's a long-winded answer to your question, but yes, at the site scale, that's where we will be addressing it.
And you'll be providing a recommendation to the city on all of these, a municipal code? You'll write that municipal code, or?
Yes.
You will write that?
Correct, we will.
Oh, okay, and we're going to review all these codes at the end of this exercise. I guess, what, another year? This will, maybe we can discuss timelines at the end of the presentation.
We will. I'll jump back to that timeline, and yes, we'll get to that.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on sustainability? Oh, I did want to mention, so I mentioned in parking design, I would talk about it. So one of the things we know, the EV, being EV ready and having parking requirements for a certain number of EV spaces. I think that's a direction a lot of communities are heading. You know, we're going to work with the technical committee on different approaches of what that means and how many and that kind of thing, but it would be in that parking design area where we would start to address, do some areas need EV parking? Is that is it an incentive? Is it a requirement? What are the implications of that from utilities, and which providers are setting those spaces up now, and how do we coordinate that from a technical aspect? But that's another site-based example of a sustainability issue getting embedded in the code.
It looks like Kate has her hand up now.
Thanks. These are great to have in here. And I'm just wondering, with some elements, do we feel pretty confident that we would have strong enough or enough information to be able to write code on all of these different elements within the time frame? Or are there things that may need additional study? Like I'm wondering with landscape design or like a green infrastructure plan or something like that, are there some elements that in order to do at a block scale or at a larger scale, we would need to have additional information, like to see what would be needed in order to write whatever regulations are needed to get to that goal? Like, do you need, how much, like if you were going to be able to do block scale or large scale, like stormwater management, like within tree wells or something, like how would we know as a commission or as a team, like what size do you need in order to say what those design regulations are?
Excellent question. I think you hit on a number of things that are all accurate. So the first part of, will we get to things that maybe there's not a standard in here now, but there's a placeholder for when the conversation and policy has evolved to where we now know the direction we're going, we have a place for it. So I would expect some of that will happen. The other part of your question is, I think, goes more towards, so take the block scale, and stormwater management is a good example of that, where we would expect to have more performance oriented things, and we don't want the code to be a barrier to the best solution. So we right now, even not having all of the information we would need, we can safely say that we know stormwater could be better addressed in streetscapes or at a block scale level than it can on a site-by-site basis. We don't know what that design is, and we wouldn't be able to regulate to that design, but we would certainly want your performance standard that says, every development site needs to meet a runoff standard of X, and they need to meet a water quality standard of that runoff of Y. We would want a potential block scale solution to easily be able to solve that as well. So we don't want the code to say you need to have that all on site. We want to be open to other solutions. Would be an example of, we may not have enough information to know what that solution is right now, but we can certainly key your performance standard to be open to all of those solutions in a context-based way. And then there are others where we do think we'll be able to take a good crack at a baseline standard for you based on all the policy and discussions you've had already as well. Carl, you had a question as well?
Yeah, I'm a little confused on how some of the regulations will apply to the overall city, like parking. Parking for an ADU is going to be a little different than for a large apartment building. How does the regulations cover the whole realm of the city?
Yeah, so I think two parts to your question: one, the specific parking one, and then two, the broader area of, a lot of times we're mentioning having different standards for different contexts. Usually the way we handle that is it's fairly easy to set the base standard. Where we usually deal with things that are based on context is, do we have credits, flexibility, or exceptions that in certain cases we know that base standard may not be the exact right standard, and so let's consider other options. So when we get into the drafting, you'll see that we have one of the reasons we break the framework into these topics and then even the subsections, we want all of the sections to start with either an intent, what we call intent statements, things that say what we want this standard to achieve, or a design objective, something that says we want our outcome to be this. Well, when the standards aren't leading to that intent or that design objective, that tells us that we're going to want to consider other options. And the current code already has a provision that says alternative compliance. So that does let us take different parts of the city and make sure we're meeting the intent and the objective of it, but it may be met in different ways in different parts. So broadly speaking, that's one of the ways we will handle how the standards can be flexible for different parts of the city. To your question on parking, that's an example of one of the standards that it's not too difficult to have a different standard for each place. So for example, an apartment building, your requirement is going to be on a per unit basis. On a site, it's going to be on a per unit basis, and an ADU is a unit, so it only needs one parking space under your current code. We think that's probably pretty appropriate. And how do you design and fit it in? A larger apartment building, one of the things we might want to add is some more nuance to it, because that you can start to pin the parking to the types of units. So maybe some more nuance on the per bedroom rate of a 1-bedroom unit, a 2-bedroom unit, a 3-bedroom unit, all have different parking requirements. So can we have better nuance to it to figure out what's the right fit for that particular apartment building or multifamily building? And then the third layer would be backing out to what I said for the context overall. If that parking unit is or apartment unit is right at a transit stop or station, that should immediately elevate it to one that should get the largest amount of credits for possibly not needing that many parking spaces. And so we'll have decision-making criteria that would let you have more flexibility and to back that down perhaps.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Whoops. Unless, were there any more questions on sustainability? I didn't mean to jump ahead. Just interrupt me if you have any. So housing mix and options. We have the next three main topics are all housing, with the exception of the attainability one being coordinated with the DOLA grant. First level is mix and options. The committee spent a lot of time on this, and these are some of the main things we're gleaning from both the public discussion and your discussion. Being more open to ADUs in different contexts, provided we heard a lot of the concerns from the public, and so they're okay with that idea as long as some of those issues that could impact the neighbor are solved. And so we're pretty confident we can come up with solutions for that. We're having discussions on how to allow smaller lots, not just if they're existing, which you have a lot of them in that 3,000 to 6,000 range, but they're simply grandfathered in. Is that a tool that can allow us to have more housing options, yet keeping the development at a smaller neighborhood scale while still adding what I would say is valuable density, not density just for the sake of density, but density that gets us more housing options, density that gets us more people that can support transit, density that gets us more people near a walkable commercial neighborhood. So that type of thing. Reducing the per unit lot sizes for row houses and apartments sounds a bit counterintuitive, but we do think that could maybe bring down the scale of some of the buildings as well that are coming in that are more, they can get us more neighborhood scale density. And so that's being explored. And then revisiting all of the mixed use districts and the larger apartments that you're getting now, and how do we approach those in the future. And so where we will plan on addressing that, again, moving to a more building type approach, where we take all of those types that we've been discussing and we start to better assign them to the zoning districts that they're appropriate for. And so we plan to do that all right here in this one section, so it's all right there. So all of our menu options from the smallest scale to the largest scale will be clearly laid out as to what district they go into. And what we do anticipate anyway, is that a lot of the potential capacity may be steps for future decisions. So if we really improve these MUR3 zoning districts, for those larger scale projects that are currently being done through PUDs, those will obviously need future rezoning actions to consider them. And so they'll be based more on plans and policies, but at least we know if we fix those zoning districts to be really good at the narrow strategic areas where you want higher density, we can have better decision-making criteria there. So that's one of the areas we're focusing on, not just the single family neighborhoods as well. And then the other area where we'll address the housing is through the subdivision and community design standards, and the platting process and the procedure. So we know that I mentioned earlier that you guys don't use the platting and community design to lay out large new subdivisions because you're largely built out, but you have different issues from procedures of what's the easiest way to plat a new project, or potentially combine a couple lots into a project, or split a lot into one or two projects. So all of those options that we've been talking about have implications for that procedure section as well. And so those will be the two areas where housing mix and options and the things we've been talking about have the biggest impact on the code. Yeah, Christine.
Yeah, I remember hearing a lot of pushback on slot homes. I think they're called in Inglewood and in surrounding communities that have seen a lot of them. Can you remind me where we stand on allowing or not allowing, incentivizing or discouraging those?
Good point. And we had a discussion just last week with the staff on that. In my mind, and Brian or Brooke, chip in at any time if you think I'm wrong. The concern for that is, I think some of the examples, and maybe not in your community, but the ones that we're aware of in Denver that have caused a lot of concern, deal with an adjacency problem, really large massing, really tight to a side lot line of a smaller scale house. So we think that issue can be addressed, and help allow perhaps the same or similar amount of units in that same circumstance with the right standard adjacency standard from a design standpoint of massing. The other aspect is, well, there's three. I said two, but there's three. The second one, second most important one, is the streetscape. A lot of those slot homes clearly look like they just turned the project sideways, and there's a side on the street,
Right.
or there's a large driveway and garage on the street. And so we think we can address that through residential frontage design standards, which will be on the next slide. So improving that, are you contributing to the character of your community rather than just taking from it? And then the third one is that some of those, there is a sort of a livability aspect to it too. Are they fronting on usable open space, or are they simply walking out into a fence or alley that's not the most livable thing? And I think those probably go in that order of importance. So we have been discussing standards that would address that. And essentially what the slot home is in our mind is it's either what we've been calling a row house that's turned sideways and just has a different frontage, or it's a multi-unit building that just has configured its buildings in a way that we couldn't really anticipate in a clear building type. So that's a long-winded way of me saying we're not going to be completely against them. We recognize the flaws of the ones that have been problematic, and we think some of the design standards should help enable some of those projects to be less objectionable.
Christine, this is Brooke. I wanted to chime in on this. We did some work with the Planning Commission on this in 2018, kind of in a little bit into 19, and we made some good headway on it, and it's been a very big issue in Denver, such that even though they completely rewrote their code in 2010, by 2017 they kind of needed to take another look at it for slot homes. But to sort of add on to Chris's comments, one of the reasons they're so popular is because they're so efficient, and that has some actually good affordability components to it. But what we found was that Denver really did make some good strides in dealing with slot homes. and our code currently doesn't address it. But what we were starting to work on in 2018 was very, very close to Denver's code. And I think there is a sort of a home for slot homes in our code. And so there's a lot of work to be done there, but we were very cognizant of it and spent a lot of time last Thursday on that. So is there, I don't know, anything else to put in on that? I do think the important part of it is the design standards that go along with it. How it interacts with the street, setbacks from side property lines, actually even potentially height and landscaping and lot coverage. So I think we are looking at all that, but I think there is a place for them, and really where it stems from is how in our older city blocks, our lots tend to be narrow and deep. And the reason that slot homes have been popular, whether it's Denver or Inglewood, is because of that, the way lots were platted in the 1900s, early 1900s. So, but that we're very cognizant of that. I'm very sensitive to that. So that's a great question.
Brenda, do you have a comment or question too?
Yes, I have a comment. See, and it goes back to the solar access, which, if you use the definitions that Boulder provided, can be accommodate, can be the standard for these slot homes. They can't be so large that they encumbrance the property next door to it with shade over their garden, and they can't be so tall that they encumbrance the roof with solar panels. So you see, you can make allowance for slot homes, but using that solar access, those guidelines, and really all they do is, in Boulder, they ask the developer or require the developer just to do a solar analysis. You see, just showing, oh, does your building, how much shade are you going to put over here? And then using the municipal code, if it's too much, they could still build if they get a variance. So you have a variance hearing, and the neighbors to the south can show up and they can object. So there's nothing that I think is too encumbranceing upon the developer, but that it would alleviate a lot of those questions about slot homes that people object to. That's all.
Any other thoughts or discussions on the housing options and mix? Carl?
Kind of along the same line with the small lot houses, on the survey, the height and bulk plane was a major concern for a lot of people. And that's basically on a small lot, you cannot build very high until you're blocking the solar access to your neighbor. So the small lots have a small house on them, basically. And we need to be careful on the small lots on the bulk plane. So just wanted to make a point of that.
Kate?
I guess one of the things that I struggle with, and maybe this isn't the time for the conversation, but is I'm all for solar access, and I think it's great when people have solar panels. My concern is developing some sort of standard that won't allow us to build things denser. Like Brooke had mentioned, a slot home style is very efficient for housing people at an affordable rate and using a small footprint of land and a lot less infrastructure. So when you think big picture, is that more valuable than one house's solar panels to have 10 families in a lot and using a lot less resources and a lot less, of a strain on our infrastructure? So I think those are some of the give and take that we really need to have some discussion on. So we're not, only thinking down one way in terms of being sustainable and not thinking big picture about what is a better use of, city resources and more efficient overall for sustainability. So just some things to consider.
Yeah, I agree. I think all of the points that are being brought up are examples of why we think two areas of the code that we're big believers in are going to be really important. One, in the applications and procedures, those decision-making criteria. So when you do hit a sticking point of, hey, there's two competing interests here, how do you make a decision in that situation? And so we want the procedures part should help. It won't always answer the question. It won't be an easy thing to answer, but at least it will bring up the things that we're just stating right now, and be able to try to find that win-win solution as well, because I think in a lot of these cases there is a win-win solution out there. The other part that we think will be very important to the code is all of these sections having intent statements or design objectives, so that we can start to identify those. I keep going back to those things where we're going to want to be open to either exceptions or alternatives in the standards, but it's also pointing out to where we can solve two things with one solution as well. It's not always competing issues, but I think both of those things, decision-making criteria and then the intent statements and design objectives, will help make sure that all of these ideas aren't lost. That's the biggest thing is we would want to avoid. So for example, it's not, we won't want the code to be prioritizing slot homes and making the claim that, like, well, solar access isn't important. No, they're both important. And the question will be, how do our standards identify that and come up with a set of base standards that get us to a good balance, and then procedures and decision-making criteria that let us really reconcile the toughest questions. Any other thoughts or comments or questions on the mix? The next slide is kind of related, so it might spur up some of them, and we've kind of hit on a little bit of that already. But the big part of housing and infill is we want to preserve and protect neighborhood character as well. And so the bullet points on the left are some of the things we're going to be doing. We've already kind of touched on the idea of lot coverage is a big part of that. But as we get smaller, we know it's not going to be a one size fits all on the lot coverage. So we're beginning to look at how those standards align up. We also know that scale and mass is as important, or perhaps even more important, than lot coverage. And so where is the appropriate balance and trade-off for that in the different zoning districts? That's the other part of this is, we want to make sure the R1 versus R2 versus MUR3 all kind of tier up on that, so that everyone in those districts has a shared level of expectations within those kind of scale and massing and coverage standpoints. The other aspect that we've heard, and this gets back to the slot home question, it gets back to our point on streetscapes. The city has some standards that try to deal with streetscape or curb appeal, however you want to treat it or state it, but the idea that street design is one of the more important aspects of neighborhood character, and the frontages of how a building relates to that, how it's landscaped, how the massing of that building front relates to that street is crucially important to lining up as well. So we do think, particularly when we start to mix a range of building types in some districts, like you do a little bit in the R2 districts, but you certainly do in the MUR3 districts, when you're starting to mix building types, having a common frontage, and by saying that, I mean a common way that the building relates to the street. it blends together a lot of things that erase sort of, oh, that's a 3-story building versus that's a 2-story building. If the focus is on how you relate to the street, a lot of those mixes can begin to happen. We think it'll be really important in those districts. The slot home one is the perfect example. One of the first problems we spotted was, well, that's because it's not a frontage, it's the side of the building on the street, and nobody thinks that's very appealing. And so we can do something about that. Yeah, Christine.
Does frontage include porches, front porches?
Yes, it does. Right now, there's a current standard which allows that to be an exception to the lot coverage and to the setbacks. And so one of the questions will be, should all of the all the buildings face the street? And by facing the street, what does that mean? It may not always be a front porch, but we're big believers in there's entry features that are single human scale, that it's social space, and it's also a 1-story massing element on the front of the building, kind of like you see in the picture, although that's a fairly crude graphic and it's conceptual only, so take it for what it's worth. But that 3-story building having a 1-story human-oriented element on it brings down, that's a really important thing to bringing down the scale of that building in that particular context, and can make it relate to the street better. So we are big believers in that. We're going to try to advance on that. You currently have a few things in the code addressing that. There are more options than they are requirements. So we do think if we go to a requirement, we're going to need to be open to a lot of different solutions than just a porch. But the idea of social space oriented to the street and a structural 1-story element is really important to the frontages.
That sounds great. One more question then. Does neighborhood character or frontage type ever include the roof shape? In that picture, it looks like the building itself stands out quite a bit, not just because of its size, but because of its shape.
Yeah, we would probably categorize that more into building massing as a whole. So that problem usually comes in districts when you're mixing 2 and 3-story buildings, or 1 and 3-story buildings, or the 4 buildings. So that's where we would look at it. So it may not be purely roof shape, but that's certainly a large component of the massing. And so, yeah, we are looking at your bulk plane standards and knowing that's the starting point. What nuance can we add to that lets some of these building types mix better is one of the things we're exploring. And it may mean additions to your bulk plane that go beyond massing. Because one of the things we pointed out about the bulk plane standards is it essentially just puts a big tent over the property, which does solve one part of massing, but it doesn't necessarily require the building to be broken up into smaller masses itself. And so do we add that element to the massing standards? Do we look at changing the bulk plane to do what it's sought to achieve in a more effective way? Or is it working pretty well and we just need to move on from there? Those are all kind of options that we're exploring as we start to land on some of these coverages and setbacks for the different building types.
Okay, yep, that makes sense. It seems like developers would want to do the building type like it shows, really square and blocky, because they could get more units or more square footage in there. But it seems like the neighbors who are looking at neighborhood character might like if there was a roof shape that kind of blended in a little better. So it seems like conflict there. Though Bernie might have some perspective on that, and he usually brings me around to his way of thinking.
Yeah, go ahead, Bernie.
Yeah, a couple things. I'm speaking more right now about what I would call more traditional alley loaded, lower density lots throughout the city, single family home, duplex, etc. I would really like to see the front setback reduced to 20 feet from 25 feet. The reason for that is I think it's a very, very workable front setback. And I think what it will allow to do, what it would allow is for some additional space to be added to some fronts of homes that are more workable on remodel situations. And it would allow potentially for more open space in the rear of the home. The other thing I would like to add is that right now there are some allowances for front porches, and that's great, and I understand that. I would like to see that allowance expanded to single-story elements, even if it is habitable space, because I think that the reality of what we're dealing with in building and trying, you know, if I go in and try to build a single-story home in a predominantly single-story neighborhood, even if it is a remodel, you're up against lot coverage issues. And so if we can balance some of the potentially greater lot coverage allowances with some massing that helps bring things down to the street level, then I think that would help with a lot of these issues, because it's just that the finished square footage is much more valuable to most people. I'm not even talking from a developer or builder's perspective. I'm just saying, in trying to maintain a home and to deal with the realities of some of the lots that people are given with. So that's one thing I would like to see considered. The other is, and you know, this I usually don't go this way, but I do think that the front setbacks on some of the main street and some of the more, let's call it, 3, 4, 5-story developments, they should be looked at in the context of what they are. And I do think that in some cases the setbacks too minimal. I think that when you look at how they are put together in reality, I think that we should be looking at some additional standards there, especially in townhomes and others, to allow for proper stoops and, circulation, because the stairs become a really big issue. And then, if it's a north facing street and you're up against that front property line, it does take away. And I think your slide here shows that example perfectly. I think that there should be some individual context-based standards that are very clear, very simple, but allow for that balance of existing street character and patterns along with new development.
Okay, good. Yeah, one of the ideas that I think I mentioned earlier on the frontage type ideas, if we can begin to package the concept of a frontage as a kit of parts of, it's dealing with driveway access, garage placement, front building design, front entry feature, and maybe have 4 different options and then begin to identify which ones go appropriately, and maybe not in which zoning district, but on which street. And so the idea of a north facing street needing a different solution hadn't really even occurred to me until you said that, but it's certainly a way where we can add a context-based element. One of the things we observed is a lot of your smaller homes on the side streets do have a much tighter setback than is currently allowed, but they look appropriately scaled to that street. And so it's a combination, I think, of building height as well, street, but that is one of the examples where we do want to allow greater flexibility. What criteria come from that flexibility will be yet to be determined, but the idea of the ability to look at a site in context and go, oh, this area needs, if we had A through D frontages, well, these are predominantly C frontages, so the entire block should be C frontages. That's part of the decision-making criteria that we would like to at least explore building into the code to give it a little more nuance, but a little more focusing on the key point we've heard from people is that how these things relate to streets and streetscapes is really important.
I wanted to add one comment in. Thanks for your comments, Bernie, and I wanted to kind of chime in on that. And that is, we went through a sort of a period of wanting to push, and we're still in that period, but wanting to push buildings to the street. And that was partially a response to having parking lots right off of major streets, and especially in commercial areas. Think of Broadway and wanting to pursue buildings more on the street in a more urban character, as opposed to the street and then a parking lot and then the building. But I think cities have perhaps taken that a little bit too far. such that liberalizing our standards and actually making build two lines in terms of setbacks, forcing buildings to the street too closely, that we don't have enough setbacks in some cases, even in an urban context, to have a good feeling for this sort of clearly public space, semi-public space, and then private space, and good landscaping and streetscaping to go along with all of that. So I personally am very sensitive to that, and so I think those are points well made.
Any other comments on the neighborhood character element? Okay, as I mentioned, the attainability one is the last part that we'll be rolling in, that sixth criteria that we'll be rolling in. But essentially what we plan on doing is bringing some of these detailed issues to the technical committee under these 4 overarching themes. We haven't quite set up meetings and agendas specifically under them, but our technical committee is essentially key staff. So talking about things of, okay, for housing options, you know, here's the options we think we're going to land on. What are the practical and technical issues with those? What utility issues do we need to be concerned about? How do we get through permit and design review for these different types? What are the platting issues? So a lot of those things that are going to touch different departments that we need to get all of their input to help us build the code. So a lot of these main topics that we've grouped with the technical committee are going to require that sort of shared knowledge to get us to the right set of standards. So we plan on doing that June through August, and essentially that will be building us to the initial draft. I'm going to back up a minute. I did not put that schedule slide in at the end, but the early on question of will this all be coming back to us in draft form of draft code? Yes. When you look at the schedule, it's a pretty aggressive schedule. So I was kind of smiling, I think, when that question was there. So we're prepared to move at this pace. We think we can do it with, you know, the reason we spend a lot of time having these discussions and dealing with the framework up front is it's easier to draft the code in short focused spurts than it is to drag it out. And we think we get better results, but it does put a premium on people's time. So bottom line is we think we're prepared to meet the schedule. If we find that either the technical committee or steering committee needs to slow down, we'll do that as well. But you look to be seeing some of these things coming to you in draft format later in the summer, early in the fall. One of the ways we present the drafts, we don't expect you to read every single word. If you want to, we welcome that. If you're one of those people that's predisposed to it and like doing that, we welcome that. But if you're sitting there saying, oh my gosh, I'm never going to have the time to read the code, it will be fairly long, hopefully shorter than your current code. That's always a goal of ours, but there'll be some long detailed sections. We'll also be providing what we call a section map. So it will identify where things are in your current code, where we have them in the new code, and a brief summary of what we may have changed and why. And so for most of the code, if you're able to browse through that and get a good comfort level, you can. If any of those things pique your interest on things you're really passionate about or concerned about, you can go dive deeper into that. So we try to present the drafts in a way that lets you spend as much time as you want and as little time as you need on it. So that's just more of a heads up moving forward. So moving back to
Carl, did you have a comment?
Yeah, you just mentioned the time frame of the whole project. Is it set in stone that it has to be done a certain date, or can it be extended? Or if there's some things that need to be looked at, changed, and discussed, will we have time to do that?
From my perspective, I think it goes back to an earlier question by, I think, Kate, about will there be things that we don't get everything we aren't ready to put things in the code and we need to work on and build it in. So I think we will hit a decision point on some of those where it's, do we hold certain topics for future debate and discussion yet move ahead with the rest? Or do we slow down to get it right and not meet that schedule? We run into that all the time as the outside consultant. So we would be prepared for either of those options, and it wouldn't be unusual for us to do so. But to your specific question, I'll let Brian or Brooke answer the timeline question, but we're prepared to react in either way it goes.
Yeah, I think right now our timeline is we're looking at the end of the year, this year, the beginning of next year to get it adopted. So it's aggressive, but we're going to try to stick to it as best we can right now.
Is there a reason for it to be aggressive?
Brooke, I don't know if you have any comments on when this project kicked off.
Well, I guess I do. This, not to be totally contemporary, but we started this before COVID. And so that was 2020. We're now in 2022. I do think from a funding and quite frankly, from a residents of the city and city council, there is a desire to update the code and address any number of issues, including issues like neighborhood character, affordability, housing options, all those things. So yeah, I think there's always some level of urgency, and as a public organization, I think we need to respect all the citizens of the city, and this was funded by city council and by all the citizens. So I think there's an expectation on some level of getting it done. But at the same time, it has been some different years in terms of COVID, and these are difficult issues, and we want to get them right. So I think we want to get it right, and we want to be timely. And so it'll take what it will take. The comprehensive plan took longer than may have been anticipated, but it got done, and it's been a good document. So yeah, I think we need to continue our work and press forward and do this in a timely manner.
Yeah, I think well, you don't want to sit on it forever, but it is going to last probably 20 years like the last one has, and it can be changed whenever changes need to be done. But unless you have to make changes, it's going to last for 20 years. And it'd be nice to make sure that it's done as accurately as possible, is my only point.
Agreed.
Christine, did you have something to say as well?
Different topic if there's no more discussion on that one. Okay, two things. I was noticing on the sustainability list over to the right, xeric landscape, and I think a priority is not just water-wise, but pollinator friendly, that I think would include some colorful plants, low water colorful plants, as opposed to some people, when you hear xeric landscape, you think just plain rocks, which is not what we're going for. So that's maybe a language thing, just to make sure that that's in there correctly. And then my question, I remember we talked about zoning districts and that we had a lot of them, and that you think that the ones we have are pretty good. My question was on the industrial and manufacturing warehouse areas, because that was left, as I recall, in kind of a gray area where city council wants to keep encouraging the jobs that are there, but we also have such a severe housing shortage that that could be an area for multifamily. I wondered where we left that.
I can start, and Brooke and Brian would probably have more specific info, but from our perspective, those are examples of, we know the citywide code needs all of those. Whether something converts from one to another is more of a planning policy and rezoning decision than what we'll address in this. But we are sensitive to that transition, and we just haven't anticipated doing too much to the industrial districts because we haven't heard that there's too many things wrong with what they're doing now. We do know that there's been industrial transitioning to really PUDs, but for a large housing component project. But Brooke or Brian, do you have any other insights into that issue politically or policy wise?
What I would say is, if you're looking at that, you would look to our or at least our guiding plan is our comprehensive plan.
Yes.
That's what tells us that what was adopted by city council is what's telling us what their expectations are for our future. And that would give us our insight as planning staff as to what types of projects that we might recommend, or things of that nature.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Brian said. It's kind of more of a comprehensive plan type of issue. Yes, and in terms of pollinators, I don't know, that would be an interesting thing to add into the code. And yes, I do know that butterfly bush, and I'm a landscape architect originally, so I'm very sensitive to that as well. But yes, I think those types of nuances in the code are important. And yes, Xeriscape was spelled correctly. Xeric is the Latin root for dry, not meaning zero as in no landscaping, but xera as in drought tolerant types of plantings. The opposite of that is mesic, which is the Latin root for wet. So yes, we want our code to be sensitive to drought tolerant landscapes without them being rock or concrete. So yeah, those are great points. But getting back to the bigger picture of the industrial uses, that is, as Brian said, more of a comprehensive plan type of look at it.
Okay, that makes sense. A couple of follow-on questions. So I hear you that this isn't necessarily the right venue for that discussion, but are you going to have a slide or a page or something of future considerations for city council, like things that don't fit right in here, but that came up in the discussions for them to consider? And if so, maybe it could be one of the bullet points on that slide. And then, okay, so that was a suggestion, a commentary. I think we probably do need to allow some more multifamily in those industrial areas, especially because they happen to be right near the transit, which is also what we want to encourage. Now, I have a question and I don't know where to direct it. And I think this is probably a square peg in a round hole for this committee. But if we do have more multifamily in those industrial areas, I was noticing that those streets are wide enough for bike lanes, whereas a lot of our older streets aren't. But once we start putting multifamily in there, then people start to park there, and then you lose all hope of putting in a bike lane because people depend on the parking. So I don't know how to consider that whole issue kind of comprehensively, and see if we could consider bike lanes and multifamily in parallel in those wider street areas. So again, I don't know where to put that comment. It's just something that's been in my head for a while.
I might be able to take part of this if y'all don't mind.
Please.
Here, I'll turn my camera on for this one. I think the way the process is working right now with the PUD system is probably one of the better modes to accomplish multifamily in that area, because it's done on a project by project basis instead of going in and trying to add that as a land use in where projects could pop up without a lot of other consideration. So I think the way the system is working right now is probably one of the better ways for that to work, whether, you know, the comprehensive plan is looking at it, but the PUD process seems to be one of the better processes because there's such a holistic look at the project itself that they can go into all those different nuances of the multimodal issues that we need to address, as well as some adjacency issues. And some of the projects seem like their parking issues and other things are addressed that way.
Okay, that makes sense. But some of the big PUD, I think, projects I've seen, for instance, around Oxford and Windermere, I know we don't need to dwell on this, so I'll try to be quick. It seems like they're working building by building or complex by complex rather than looking at a bike lane for that whole block or a few blocks at a time. So if you're doing building by building, it seems like a bike lane would never happen until it's too late.
Well, the other part of it, when we do these PUD processes, is we have additional plans that we work through, like our walking wheel master plan and other plans that each development that comes in gets to work on kind of a portion of that where we meet the end goal. So we have a goal in mind, and then each piece that comes in gets to bring in their portion of those. So with a lot of those projects, we have a lot of additional standards that they have to meet and install additional things.
From our perspective, one of the things we would want this code to do is to at least that getting back to the street design and street sections in the code, we won't be regulating a lot of those into existence because you have built out street systems, but we still think that street you described, the one that shows how to balance on-street parking with bike lanes in a very multimodal standpoint, is a section that needs to be in there. It may not be the exact section that fits in the context you're talking about, but at least the goal is captured. And then when those PUDs that Brian's talking about come along, you have a starting point to go, okay, we need this. We need to figure out how it fits in here, what compromises we need to meet from this ideal section in this particular context. And then the third part that Brian mentioned, how do we build it over more, or is this something that needs to be invested in now? Sometimes it's even invested in advance. So there will be, that would be an example of the code kind of guiding capital projects, which that would be great if that happens. But we want to have a range of street types that are that starting point for the discussion at least.
Brenda, did you have a comment?
Well, yeah, let me just expand on that for Christine, because I'm on the Planning and Zoning Committee. So Christine, do download the comprehensive plan because it shows where the city hopes and to invite investors to buy up those old industrial properties. Now, whether or not it's market driven. So if an investor wants to build there, they will, but they can't, but the city can't say, oh, everybody, we will build this out for apartments. So and I'm sure you're aware of that. And then the thing is there's a lot of people who don't want it in their backyard. So, we can't really plan for bike lanes until all this stuff is actually built. And if the city, and if those neighbors want it there, and if city approves it. And just because we have more apartments doesn't exactly guarantee that the price point's going to come down. The apartments that they're building on Navajo, there's a whole bunch. And it is not really fit. What I'm hearing on next door is that there is not the streets that are going to be able to support that. Now, the developers that are building just south of Jason at the Galapago and the old Elks Lodge, they've made some promises towards giving money towards the pedestrian bridge, and they're going to do some bump outs for traffic. So all we can do is ask these developers for these kinds of, or have them entice us with these kinds of things, like, well, you build us a bike lane if you build it here. But that's only after the city says no. And they're probably, you know, I don't know how that's going to turn out. I can't, you know, discuss it too much. I'm on the committee, but that we do want, the city encourages it with the master plan. So there it is. Look at the master plan, the comprehensive plan, I'm sorry. And there's all this industrial property. And then it's up to those owners if they want to sell it or not. Now, if they come along and say no, I mean, if the neighbors really don't want it, they're not likely to build a bike lane out there. And then, of course, the bike lane does fall after a capital budget. And the city coffers only have so much to build out, say, Navajo Street, because that's a pretty narrow street and it's pretty, pretty strange through there. But anyway, I just want to clarify that where this kind of information happens and kind of how PUDs come into play. Everybody keep in mind, we have 3 huge developments, and what's really nice is that they're at different price points. One is luxury, one is middle, and one is, we do have some lower price points, some studios that they're putting in, alley facing right behind the city code office. I think the price point's right around $250, $300. And so we do have some exciting things happen that I think that a lot of this applies to. And that I think that, you know, setting these guidelines today will set some things in stone for other PUDs who, and maybe some neighbors would be more receptive to PUDs in the future along that Navajo route. If we can get the capital budget for widening that street.
That sounds good. It seems like a lot of the neighborhood pushback for multifamily is not in the industrial areas. It's in the are already built out in single family areas where people don't want huge structures. I don't know that anyone cares as much if a multifamily goes into industrial area, right? But my concern was that a bike lane would get missed because right now there's a lane for it. Because almost no one drives down there except a few people that work at each warehouse. And then if a multifamily goes in, then there would be demand for it, but there'd also be demand for street parking, and then it's too late. So to make sure we get that window. So I liked what you said, Chris, about putting in the recommendations, at least for the PUDs to consider that, so that at least it gets in the discussion at a time at the right time, not too early and not too late. Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? That's kind of where we're at. As we discussed, we're getting ready to put our foot on the gas pedal with the draft. That's where we're headed. That's all we had. Does anyone else on the committee have any questions or comments or things to discuss? Brian, I'll kick it back to you. We may be finished unless staff had stuff.
No, I don't have anything additional. Brooke, did you have anything else that you wanted to touch on tonight?
No, not really. No, I think it's been a very good meeting, and we thought it would actually, going through all this, these words and narrative would be sort of boring, but I don't think it ended up that way. So thank you to the group and Chris. Yeah, I think this was a productive meeting. So thank you all.
Yeah, we appreciate all of your insight and all your comments. And sadly enough, these parts of the code rewrite are some of the most interesting for us as planners. Chris, I see Chris smiling. We've had a lot of in-depth conversations about these in the last few weeks, but if y'all have any other questions or comments or anything, please send them to me and we'll get them to Chris and to the rest of the staff, and we'll keep working on them, and we appreciate everything that you guys do.
Thanks,
We
everyone.
appreciate you guys too.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.